Hello everyone, my name is Sheldon. I'm a counseling psychologist here at Shamiri Institute, and it's my pleasure today to talk to you about men's mental health in this May Ask the Expert segment. So when you're talking about the mental health of men, you also have to talk about a lot of societal issues. So these are gender norms, masculinity, how boys are brought up, and I think even more importantly and pressingly for a lot of young men today is, what does it even mean to be a man in this 21st century? So I'm hoping that perhaps by the end of this small conversation, this small chat, it will become a bit clearer about what men's mental health is, how men experience their own mental health, and some of the things that we can do as individuals and as communities to more effectively support men. So the first thing in talking about men's mental health that's a big challenge is just defining it. Mental health is quite a broad term which encompasses like a lot of human related things. So there's a lot of definitions, and I think that we won't get to a true definition of mental health for a while, but I think maybe for today we can go with WHO's definition, where mental health is the state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with life stresses, be able to fulfill their abilities and contribute to their community. And if you look at that, then this means that there is a strong emotional side, psychological side, and social side to mental health, and thus I think our conversation today will revolve around those three areas: on the emotional, psychological, and social lives of men. So to our first topic on the emotional lives of men, is quite a complex thing to talk about, because you do have to realize that men do start out as boys, and I think a lot of the issues that come around how men express themselves emotionally do stem from how they're raised. And in African and maybe even like wider worldwide context, the emotional upbringing of young boys is often wanting, because I'd imagine this is a very common experience for a lot of men and boys, where you grow up being told that you shouldn't cry, or you shouldn't, and if you're growing up being told you shouldn't cry, then essentially what you're being told is that you should not feel or maybe even express your sadness or your worries or your fears or your anxieties. And if you think about the effects of not being able to be vulnerable from a young age, then they are definitely going to carry over to later in life, where now as young men or maybe even older men, you really do not have the precedent for how to begin to talk about the emotional struggles which you are facing. And this is quite unfortunate, because men still, like women or children, still face and experience the same emotional turmoil that other people do, but without the language and without the experience of being in an environment that encourages you to talk about how you feel, then there really is no way for men to effectively communicate how they feel, given they do not have an experience of where they would even begin, and the environments that they live in also do not encourage this type of behavior or this type of action. And I think this is perhaps one of the key drivers of the taboo of why men's mental health is such a taboo topic, especially between men, because in speaking about mental health, if one was to say, for example, that I am struggling in this area of my life, or I am struggling with one or two, three issues, or maybe I am struggling and I don't know why, it becomes an admission of weakness, an admission that you are experiencing fear and anxiety and worry. And if you grew up being told that these are things that you should not feel or you should not express, then of course now later down in life it becomes something that you refuse to talk about, not just because like it's a topic that's taboo, but just because it's something that you really do not have the precedence to talk about. Because I think mental health is becoming something easier to talk about with time, but it still remains more stigmatized and more taboo driven, I'd say, between men, or rather among men. And I think that's perhaps one of the key problems that we look at here. And you have to realize that the emotional lives of men, should they go unexpressed, do often lead to a lot of the mental health problems or challenges that men face, because it becomes something of a pressure cooker that's just boiling in. And more often than not, if these emotions are left unexpressed for a long time, it doesn't mean they'll go away. It just means they'll build up, and then unfortunately one day they will, in one way or the other, explode. And of course, it doesn't have to be in a very dramatic or violent way, because that's not the only way that men experience mental health challenges. It could also be the explosion of this emotional turmoil that a man has been experiencing. Could also be in just withdrawing from life, in setting themselves aside from everyone else, or rather in acting in ways and behaviors that are more typical towards depression. So they could withdraw from life. They fail to find interests, they fail to find their interests to be any more enjoyable, and still, even in the worst cases, this could drive men to harm themselves. And if you look at the statistics of it, one of the key causes of mortality among men is actually suicide. And this really does tie back to being able to express yourself. And of course, now this will now tie back to not being able to talk about it from when you are very, very young, and thus not being able to talk about it when you're much older. And of course, when you're talking about the emotional lives of men, it does tie in quite directly to the psychological side. And the psychological side is about, what do men think, what do the men believe about themselves and about the world. And of course, this will tie into the stigma and the tabooness of this topic. But more importantly, I think the psychological lives of men will revolve around the idea of, what does it mean to be a man? It's a question that's going without an answer for now, because if you consider today's society is looking much different. I think it's in a state of evolution, and it's not particularly as clear perhaps for young men today as it was for older generations on what it means to be a man. And in some contexts, it might be that the very behaviors that were set aside for men, so especially if you think about it from a gender relations point of view, these behaviors are no longer acceptable or just exclusive to men. So if you think about it, if you're looking at typical, or rather stereotypical, values or ideas about what it means to be a man, so this is self-sufficiency, dominance, rather being the dominant gender, or being dominant in your particular circle, and being resilient or stoic, but not necessarily emotionally stoic, or emotionally not necessarily unavailable, but not very expressive. So these are the typical behaviors which perhaps suited a different generation, but I think increasingly it's looking, and it is sort of now becoming, I'd say, a disadvantage for men today if they are not able to sort of adjust to the changing of times. And part of the psychological side of being a man will of course tie into the belief about not only just who a man is, but what makes a man. And I think this is where the social pressures of life the social pressures and expectations sort of now really begin to stress men, because even as society changes, even as roles evolve and are taken up by both genders, it still remains, do I say, a fact or a responsibility of men to still strive to be the breadwinner and succeed in this. So one of the key causes for men, or rather for stress and for mental health struggles among men, is not being able to provide, or not being financially secure and able to provide for their people, and their community. And this is like one of those things which everyone knows about it, but no one really speaks to the emotional or the mental stress and the psychological stress that comes from not being able to provide. And if you look at the state of our society today, where just as a whole the economy isn't doing quite well, which means like a lot of people still live close or even below the poverty line, and this means there are a lot of men facing this struggle, and there are a lot of men struggling, perhaps quite unfortunately silently, with this struggle still, because yet again they do not have the experience or the environment to be able to express themselves emotionally and psychologically, and share and talk about how they're feeling. And again, the psychological lives of men, as they tie into their thoughts and beliefs about what it means to be a man, are still quite important. And I think even as we sort of strive towards defining what it means to be a man, I think one of the key things, as I'd say, like as a point of advice for young and old men alike, is to still be more open, not just to the idea of what it means to be a man, but to be more open to your life as an individual, because I think one of the key things, one of the key stresses or cause of stress is being rigid in belief and in thought. And if you consider the idea of rigidity and flexibility, so the more flexible mentally someone is, the more flexible and more open they are to new experiences, then the more likely that they are going to effectively cope with the circumstances and be able to more or less effectively now bring themselves to a point where they actually can provide. And of course, when you're talking about the challenges that men face, you do have to talk just as well about the social lives and the social well-being of men. And one of the key questions of our time perhaps is, how can men effectively support each other in struggling with their mental health? And I think this is quite an interesting question, because if you look at it from a research perspective and just from experience as a man, friendships are not formed based on emotional ties or emotional intimacy. Men more often than not will form friendships based on shared activities, hobbies, workplaces. So perhaps in contrast to women who will form friendships so that they can be emotionally supportive and intimate with each other, men form friendship just based off the activities that they do. And this still is quite meaningful. So these types of relationships and friendships are still quite meaningful and satisfying. More often than not, peer support between men is going to be more task-based. So I need help doing this, or I need support, or maybe I need support or money or something doing that. So that is something like that exists in a lot of good male friendships. But when it comes to the emotional side and being able to open and speak up about how you're feeling, and to be able to have a core of people who empathize and support you, that's something that is perhaps lacking in a lot of friendships. But still, this is a good sign, because it means that there is something to work on and there is something to build on between men. So it's just a question of being more open and creating that environment where people can be vulnerable with each other. When you're talking about the social lives of men, it will still again tie back to social norms and expectations, and what men believe is expected of them by themselves and by society. And there is quite a lot of room, like I've said again, to be flexible. And I think one of the key things that perhaps could help a lot of people and a lot of men is, if you look at it from a cultural historical point of view, the idea of what a man is and how a man should be and behave tends to change quite a lot by culture, and even by the time. So our fathers and our grandfathers and their grandfathers probably had very different ideas about what a man is and what a man should be. So, and I think, like I said a bit earlier, the idea and what really helps a lot of people is to be flexible and open about what your experience is as a man and perhaps where you need to go to life, and then sort of navigate yourself towards that direction rather than sticking by a rigid set of principles and values and old norms about what it means to be a man, which perhaps are not necessarily true for where you are in your life and even the society that we live in today. One of the key questions that again is asked when it comes to men's mental health is what can be done by men, by their friends, by their partners, even by society as a whole. Like, what can we do to create, or rather to help men with their mental health? And fortunately, like, there is quite a lot that can be done. And I think perhaps one of the strongest things, or rather, yeah, one of the strongest, the most potent things that can be done is to create and to actively and very intentionally communicate that there is an environment of safety, both emotionally and psychologically, to be able now to allow men to be able to express their vulnerabilities, their anxieties, their worries, because it is still in sharing how someone is doing is often just that, yeah, just sharing how you feel is often like a very potent way of nursing or like alleviating and beginning the journey of healing. And I think like another one of the things that we have to do is, perhaps even as men, is to question very intentionally what norms and beliefs that we have perhaps stuck to, and to perhaps question if they actually are suitable and if they actually are true. And I think this will again tie into like the education, both in mental health and just the mental health education of men about, and also like the education of what it means to be a man. Because I think a lot of young men, especially today, will interact with a lot of material and a lot of messages and messaging on social media about what it means to be a man, how you should respond to stress. And some of the advice is good, some of the advice is mild or just average, and I think in some instances perhaps even more than it is good. There's going to be like a lot of misinformation about how a man should cope with stresses. So perhaps one of the more common areas or like messages that's passed across is to resign as a man when you're facing challenges, is to resign into this stoic commitment to non-emotional, not expressing your emotions, resigning into yourself, focusing on yourself, withdrawing from the world and from your friends and from your peers, and just focusing on yourself or on hustling. And I think if you really do look at the quality of this advice against how, let me say, well-adjusted people are, or like what well-adjusted men are, this advice is headed towards the wrong direction, because well-adjusted men who are comfortable, healthy and happy emotionally and psychologically and physically and even socially in their lives are close to their communities, they are close to their peers, they are expressive of how they feel, of what they think, and they have not withdrawn from the world but are actively engaged in it. So I think one of the key areas when it comes to the education of men, not just in mental health but also as people, should be like to make sure that we provide, so for those who know what should be done well and what works, I think the onus is on us to be more intentional in communicating this, in breaking down the myths and misconceptions around mental health. Another one of the key questions is, where can men seek support with their mental health? So what are like the available support groups? Where can they seek professional help if that's something that they need? Or maybe even, what are the signs that friends and family should look out for so that they can point their loved ones in that direction? And maybe perhaps I'll first start talking about like what the signs of someone who's going through a mental health challenge are, and then now we can talk about, then maybe I can share perhaps a few resources or pointers about where one can find mental health support. The tricky thing about mental health is that often the emotional and psychological side of it is quite hidden to the world. It's experienced in its fullness only by the individual. And so when you're talking about feelings of inadequacy, of worthlessness, or maybe if you have thoughts of despair and depression, these are things that are often than not you really cannot see in someone else. But for someone who is going through this, then it's quite obvious for them, and because they do get to live it on a day-to-day basis. But on the outside, on what actually can be seen, are changes in behavior, so someone going through a mental health challenge, more often than not, they will start acting in very different ways compared to how they normally are. And I guess this is something that as friends and family is quite easier. It could be easier than for a stranger to pick out, because if your cousin or brother normally does one or two, three things, then them taking like a drastic turn away from these activities, or even expressing that they're no longer interested in going about these activities, is a possible sign of mental health, that they could be going through a mental health challenge. And this isn't to say that all behavior change is driven by mental health challenges. It could be driven by entirely different things, but it's perhaps one of the things to look out for. Another key thing to look out for is social withdrawal. So sometimes some people will withdraw from their friends, they'll even withdraw from their work, they will withdraw from common activities like social activities, and there really is a fine balance to be met here, because for some people, depending on how they engage with their peers and their friends and their work, it could look very different. For some people, it could be a total withdrawal, where they'll just shut themselves at home, stop engaging in their groups, while for others, they could still be within their circles, they could still be at work or be within their group of friends, but they are not really there, they're not engaging in the same ways that they normally do. Perhaps the biggest one is just being open to someone when they are talking, because sometimes, especially in the most severe cases, where someone is contemplating about harming themselves, more often than not, they will try to express this, and it's really important to take it seriously and to treat them with the grace and kindness that they are so very desperate. They very desperately need in that time, because I think a very common reaction, especially between groups of men, is to joke and to make fun of people when they perhaps say they're going through one or two things, just as a way to sort of dismiss it, or a way to shy away from what is often a very uncomfortable topic. But I think my advice would be to just be more attentive to what the people in our lives are saying and to how they're behaving, and to be ready and open to just approach them with grace and kindness and openness to what they're sharing with us. Of course, it remains to be a complex topic, but it is not an unapproachable one. Stay open to be more caring and kind to the experiences, to both just our internal experiences and to the experiences of our friends and our family members, as they share what's going on with their lives, and to more importantly create that safe environment for people to be open and to be able to express themselves. So when it comes to where someone can seek help, fortunately there is, like I've said, there is a shift in society today, so there is quite a lot of support. Some of it, I know a lot of it is church-based, so there are a lot of like church-based groups. There are a lot of support groups, which can be found like within online communities especially, so there are quite a lot of online support groups for men. And yeah, that's the long and short of men's mental health. Shout out to Shamiri Health, who are a mental health provider through a digital wellness app called Rafi, and the services are quite accessible and affordable. So for anyone who needs this type of help, I think Rafi is just something to look up, and you can get access to quality care from the great panel of therapists that they have. As we sort of bring this conversation for today to an end, I would perhaps like to make just an appeal, just in general, about what can we do for men's mental health. And I think as individuals and as friends, as co-workers, as peers within the same groups, I think in order to be able to effectively support the men in our lives, one of the key things that we can do is to be open. Be open to our own internal experiences, be open with our peers about how we're feeling, what we're thinking, and the struggles that we're facing, and even the successes as well. And I think it is in this openness that we can now create this environment, the environment that is emotionally, psychologically, socially safe, for us to be vulnerable and to be able to effectively support each other in this game of life. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time.